of the Kiwi Rail designation. And John Dogood is coming to the table, our General Manager of Plans and Places. John, can I leave you to introduce your staff and support?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, John, just before we go to that item, I just want to double check again. Do members, having considered my opening comments on this particular item on actual or perceived conflicts on this item, is there anybody that needs to, having had the opportunity of a little bit of time between then and now, do they need to declare anything? If not, there are also a couple of documents. When I perused the agenda, I realised that we needed a bit more information on this. So there are two documents that have been tabled on the Kiwi Rail position, if you can make sure you've read those. It shows the original conditions which I asked for and the proposed provisions. They are the original conditions. They are in red text with strikeouts, and the proposed provisions are in green underlined on that page. So make sure you've got that. And John, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Mayor, councillors. So to my left is Mr. Don Munro from Auckland Transport. Don will be familiar to a number of you. Don is the Manager of Strategic Policy Integration at Auckland Transport, and with Don is Alistair Lovell, who's in Don's team. He is a statutory policy leader within Don's area at Auckland Transport. So just proceeding to the report, very brief summary. August, as you'll all be aware, last term of council, the governing body made its decisions on the Auckland Unitary Plan recommendations from the Independent Hearings Panel. For most of the recommendations, the council was making a decision, but in terms of designations for infrastructure works, unless it was a council designation, the council was making a recommendation on to the requiring authority, organisations such as Kiwi Rail, Watercare, other government agencies and so on. So that's the difference between designations and the other aspects of the unitary plan that the governing body decided in August. And what that means is that the recommendations went on to entities such as Kiwi Rail, and they then made their decisions very recently. They had 4 weeks to do so. So towards the end of September, we started as council receiving the decisions from those infrastructure providers such as Kiwi Rail. And in general, they have accepted the council's recommendations. But in terms of this particular designation for the Avondale to Southdown future rail line, which has been in place for many years, Kiwi Rail rejected a number of conditions that the panel had initially recommended to council, and then the council had recommended to Kiwi Rail. Having talked through the matter with Auckland Transport, they have concerns that the alternative conditions that Kiwi Rail has now essentially confirmed are not satisfactory, they're not detailed enough, and in particular in relation to future level crossings that would be required, grade separations to avoid level crossings, there's not as much specificity or clarity in the conditions as there were in the council's recommendations. So the recommendation is that the council would lodge an appeal in the Environment Court against that decision from Kiwi Rail. That would enable discussions to take place between the experts in council, Auckland Transport and Kiwi Rail to see whether an agreement can be reached. We're hopeful that an agreement can be reached to avoid a hearing. And the second recommendation is that delegation is given to officers to take part in those negotiations and hopefully reach an agreement or proceed to the Environment Court to determine the conditions. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
John. Is there anything to add from your point of view, from Auckland Transport's point of view, Don?
Mr. Chairman, just to say that we fully support Council's position on this appeal. We were quite comfortable with the recommendations from the panel and Council for the conditions relating to this, and felt it had sufficient specificity around road safety where public roads crossed the designation, and we don't understand why Kiwi Rail made the decision to revert, and this gives us the opportunity to commence those discussions with them to see if we can come to an agreement.
Happy to move, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. It's moved by Councillor Cooper, and do I have a second then, Councillor Lee, or you'd like to...
I'd like to speak.
We'll take questions first, but it has been moved by Councillor Cooper. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Councillor Clow. Can I just recommend, I had one small change. It's on the B, John. I would prefer that we delegate authority to you as the General Manager plans and places in consultation with the Chair and Deputy Chair. Okay. If the mover and seconder could accept. Mover and seconder.
Lead officer support, think that's necessary. Is it just machinery or?
It's about this committee's representatives, Chair and Deputy, keeping an eye on this particular appeal. I think there's an expectation that we keep a close eye on all the High Court and Environment Court
I would just
challenges.
would have assumed that would be a matter of course that you'd be kept up to date. If that needs to
Ms.
be
Purr.
spelled out, I'm sure my
Ms.
staff
Purr will
understand
respond.
that.
So it is, it is normal practice in a policy matter such as a designation that there is political input into an agreement, particularly when the agreement might be different from the position that the council recommended to Kiwi Rail. If the negotiations and discussions do not come to an agreement, then it would automatically go to the Environment Court and officers would be defending council's position. So it's only if through the discussions Auckland Transport and John actually come up with a different approach that they would then need to discuss it with the Chair and Deputy Chair, but it's quite normal practice.
Yes, I understood.
Happy to accept, Councillor Cooper?
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Clow, thank you. Now, questions on this matter?
Yeah, just
Moved and seconded. I will take questions from Councillor Lee, Casey, and then Member Henry.
I just really want to make a comment on it, Mr. Chairman, so I'll leave questions.
Okay, well, I'll take the questions and come back to Councillor Lee.
Thank you.
Councillor Casey, question?
John, I just want to hear a bit more about the safety concerns, especially with the level crossings proposed and the grade separations. My other question relates to the fact that local boards didn't comment on congestion or safety. I find that quite hard to believe.
Took my question.
Why so?
Well, Mr. Chair, probably best to hand over to Don and Alistair on the first issue of the technicalities of level crossings versus grade separation on this particular route, and then I'll just check what the report said about local boards and get back to you on that.
Don?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if you look at item 3 of the conditions in the supplementary paper that's in the green, I think if you've got it in colour, the non-strikeout, you will see that all crossings to be grade separated with the exception of local roads, and that's really the specifics of our concern, whereas if you go to the struck out condition...
Can you just stop? Can you tell me
Sorry,
which document and which page?
I've got the conditions...
We're in this big... I think members have all got that one there.
This one?
It's, and we're going to Part 7 designations. They're not numbered, but it's probably about a third of the way through.
Part 7 designations, and under conditions, the first set of conditions, item 3, it's 6303 is the designation number.
Yes, I can.
Everybody on the right page? Anybody confused? Councillor Casey, have you found the page?
Just so how many grade separations were we asking for?
So the condition that Kiwi Rail propose allows doesn't provide for grade separation of local roads, and
I
that
know.
is all
How many
of
were we
Auckland
asking for?
local roads. I don't know the number offhand.
The railway line crosses, or the proposed railway line will cross around about 24 roads, including 7 arterials and 2 T junctions. So I guess across the entire line, if all of those were built with level crossings, that's the issue that Auckland Transport's got. There would be safety and congestion issues around each of those level crossings. We don't think that condition as written provides adequate certainty that those issues can be considered later in the planning process.
And John, just, the boards didn't see that or
Yes, so
comment on
just to
it?
clarify in the agenda report under the heading Local Board Views and Submissions, what we're saying there is that as part of the council submission on its own unitary plan going back 2 or 3 years now, local boards had the opportunity to include their views in the council submission, and on this particular designation none of the local boards put in a specific view on this specific designation. So that's what the report is saying. Local boards did not specifically address the matters discussed in this report in the council submission going back 3 or so years. So they all put the views into the council submission, all bar 2 or 3 from memory, but none of the local boards specifically talked about this designation. And that's all the report is saying. It's not implying that the boards don't have a view on congestion. I'm sure they do, or
And
safety
safety.
issues. Yeah, yeah.
Clear?
Apologies if that wasn't clear enough.
Thank you, appreciate that. Member Hinare.
Yeah, just, Mr. Chair, just on point 18, Māori impact statement, and it's a generic question for this paper and all the other papers, is that who decides on whether something has an impact or not? And if it does, what's the process of determination? Who decides on whether it has an impact on Māori or not?
Is that from you, John? I'll go to Ms.
So
Perrott in response.
in a general response, and John can give you the details for this particular report, it's a requirement of the report writer to analyse whether or not the issue being addressed in the report has a specific impact on Māori beyond the general public. And so you will see different responses depending on what the particular issue is. And so it is the report writer who makes that judgment call as the writer of the
if I can get it right, whoever's writing the report decides there is an impact or there's not an impact on Māori. Do they have a checkbox system of figuring this out?
No, what we would expect officers to do would be to consider a number of documents that are available to staff, things like our Māori Responsiveness Plan, which sets out our obligations to consider the impact on both mana whenua and Mātawaka, and they would need to look at the particular issue against the, what's outlined in that document, and also under our statutory obligations. So you will find also in other reports that might be reflecting a plan change under the Resource Management Act. There is an obligation under the RMA to do early engagement and consultation with mana whenua. So that would be recorded in that particular report. So it does vary, but officers, there is no tick box. It requires them to understand our responsibilities with Māori responsiveness that this council has adopted, but also what's required under statutory.
Mr. Chair, I raised it because sometimes you see in a paper something that appears and there's no explanation of how it's done, how you came to that decision, or whether even that piece should even be in there. So it's just a generic question about this and a whole lot of other papers.
So look, thanks for raising that, and it's the first day of our planning committee, and I'm very willing to sit with the IMSB and work up how that could be written to cover off your concerns.
Yeah.
I'd be very willing to sit down with you and
I'll raise it on Monday at our board meeting, and then we'll come back with something that might help.
and we'll further refine that. Thank you, Member Hanau. Mayor Goff?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two questions actually to John or Don, whoever is the appropriate person to ask. From memory, this Avondale to Southdown line was first designated in 1943, which is about 73 years ago. So my first question is this a theoretical discussion we're having today, or is there any serious intention to go ahead with the development of this line? If so, when? That's question one. Maybe I'll put the two questions together. The second one may be a little naive, but I'm wondering why this matter has to go to the Environment Court and can't be sorted out directly with Kiwi Rail Holdings as a matter of common sense. The designations look reasonable to me. What was the problem that meant that you couldn't sit down across the table and sort this one out?
Two key questions there, John and Don.
Chair, and to the matter, if I can address the latter question. In order to, the designation is a statutory instrument now, and so the conditions that would be in place without an appeal cannot be amended, and so it's not something that can easily be negotiated. Kiwi Rail have to stick within the scope of the conditions. We don't believe the conditions are satisfactory, so it does unfortunately need an appeal to be lodged in order to sit around the table and agree alternative conditions. It's not just agreeing just some other way of addressing the impacts. The way of addressing them has to comply with the conditions that would now be a statutory document. So Kiwi Rail can't simply amend those conditions without having to go through the whole exercise of a new designation or altering them. So it's just the legal mechanism to, yes, sit around the table and agree the alternative. Ideally, it would be something that we could just sit down and agree offline, but it's a statutory instrument now with statutory conditions that Kiwi Rail is bound to that we don't believe are the right conditions.